Welcome to another episode of Authors Recommend Books. I'm your host, Bradley Verdell, and my guest is Mark Will, author and poet. We are both self-published authors. Today, we are going to recommend two books, one nonfiction and one fiction, that we think you will enjoy. And if you like our recommendations and you want to help us out, consider reading our books. Mark, what have you written? What book would you like our viewers to buy?
I'm not pimping a book today.
Oh, you're not?
No.
Nothing?
I'm gonna pimp my music instead.
Okay, pimp your music. Yeah. That's even better. Okay, you didn't see that coming. All right.
That's right. So I have an album out called Carmina Formosa. It's on Amazon, iTunes, many other digital sites. So
I'll put the link below.
Yeah, check it out. Okay,
great. And if you want to see what I've been writing, check out my Chadwick Yates series. I'm up to 7 books in the series. It'll probably be 12 or 13. Book 8 is coming out soon. I've also got another title releasing soon called The Fourth Warlock. All are fantasy set in a sort of Victorian era type world, so it's a bit steampunk and a bit of fantasy. Now, we'll get into our book recommendations. These recommendations are not sponsored. We are not being paid to advertise these books. We're writers, so we read a lot, and when we find books that we want the world to know about, we talk about them and advertise them for free. Here, if you click on the links to buy the books, we don't make any money from that either. Maybe down the road, but not now. It's not monetized right now. All right, I'm going to go first. I like to, with nonfiction, I like to read a whole mix of things. I like to read about history. I've done, so far on this show, I've done, modern historians talking about historical periods. I've also talked about books that were written a long time ago, talking how-to books set in the past. I'm going to do one now called Tips on Immigrating to New Zealand by Travis Haan. I think it's Haan. It might be Haan. It's H-A-A-N. But Travis, if you're out there, sorry if I got that wrong. I read this book because you and I are both expats living here in Taiwan, in Taipei. And so New Zealand, it's still an expensive trip, but it's not as expensive as from Tennessee, I would say, getting to New Zealand. And I thought, I might like to take a vacation to New Zealand. Well, I would love to take a vacation to New Zealand. That's not in question. But one thing I've noticed traveling around is I like to find, if I visit a place, I like to find somebody who's been living there for a long time, like either an expat or a local who, I can speak English with, and ask them, all right, give me the real, like I'm seeing the tourist side of a place. Of course I'm going to have a great time because I'm on vacation. I'm seeing the sights. I'm going to do like all the fun stuff for, a week or whatever. So like for example, not long ago I took a trip to Boracay in the Philippines.
Yes.
And I just ran into an expat when I was having a drink in the bar, and we ended up talking for like 4 or 5 hours, and I felt like now I know what it's like to live in Boracay because he gave me the good, the bad, and the ugly about living there. This is what Travis Haan's book does. If you're thinking about moving to New Zealand, he and his wife moved to New Zealand from West Texas.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, and he gives you the perspective. It is very much, for our viewers, listeners who are not from the States, that is a caveat to this book. It's definitely written from an American perspective. Like, he's definitely writing more to people in the U.S. who might want to move.
Are they retired or they just moved?
No, they're young and they just moved. I think he was in the military and he got out, and he just really didn't. I mean, I got the feeling that he just really, really didn't like living in the U.S., especially Texas. Yeah, and he I mean, I love living out of the country, but I also like living in the U.S. I don't really have a feeling one way or the other. I think the U.S. is a great country to live in. I think it's also great to see the world. But you could tell that he really wanted to get out, So there's that in mind. So from somebody coming from, especially from the UK, it's not going to be as much of a shock, right? Because it's like, you drive on the left and all that kind of stuff. So he's writing it more for like this. But what's great about this book is it's written from the perspective of someone who's not rich. I don't want to like if you're a millionaire and you're like a VP in a company, or you're a doctor or an engineer or something like that. Of course, it's going to be quite easy to move to a foreign country, but to do it on a tight budget, that's what I want to see. It's much like the sailing book that I recommended, where they talk about how anyone can do this, even if you don't have a lot of money. But New Zealand is an expensive place. So I'll just start out with one thing. He says he and his wife made their move. I think they did it on $15,000 US. But he says, what I would have done differently is have more. So really 20,000. Yeah, but he said, really 20,000 and up would be good. But he said even then, it's going to be rough. Like, things are really expensive in New Zealand. So, obviously New Zealand is great for people. I would love to go to New Zealand. I've never been there because you can surf and go shooting and hunting. It's like world-class hunting opportunities and world-class surfing and world-class hiking and skiing. And, it's an outdoors paradise, basically. And it's great that you can speak English there as well. So, and he really says that in the book. He says, like, if you're an outdoor person, this is where you want to be. But he's like, if your idea is, if you want to play video games all the time, just stay where you are. There's no reason to move to New Zealand. Or if you just want to be in like a hip city and be very social and go drinking all the time, don't move to New Zealand, because alcohol is taxed by alcohol content, making it prohibitively expensive. So you wouldn't want to move there for that. But he said, you move to New Zealand for the adventure. You don't move there for economic opportunity, because wages are quite low. And it's very hard to move up. The economy, it's not. A lot of New Zealanders move to Australia to make more money.
Right.
So you're not moving to New Zealand to make money, and you're not moving there, to be in a huge, vibrant, thriving city, because a lot of the population is quite small.
Well, where do they live? Did they go to Auckland?
They went to Auckland initially, and this is. I'm glad you said that, because I think one of the things that I took from the book was, he said, having really given the place a look, he says, I believe he says Nelson is the place he wants to live.
North or South Island?
Wish you hadn't asked me that. I believe it's on the north of the South Island, I think.
Okay.
But anyway, he says Nelson has the best weather in New Zealand. But yeah, that's where they're working to move to. Basically.
They haven't yet?
At the time of writing the book, no. But, the book's been out for a little while. But I think after, they started out in Auckland, and they kind of been looking around, right? Because, it's hard enough to move even in your home country, but if you're going to move again, you want to make sure you pick the right spot.
Well, what do they do? Or what are they going to do when they're settled? Yeah,
no, they are settled, because towards the end of the book, he gives like I guess he wrote a blog during the move, and he has like a 9-month, here's where we were at 9 months, here's where we are at 3 years. Yeah. So he's been there for at least 3 years. Oh. But he got a job, I think, working in like just a warehouse or something, very, I don't know how to say it, not something super technical, right? And then his wife, Amber, is a teacher. Okay. Yeah. And,
she works at a public school?
Didn't say, or if it said, I didn't pick up on that. But he said, but it seems like, I got the impression that they really, really struggled to get a foothold there, and they've kind of been living at or below the poverty line. They really, it's on a shoestring budget kind of thing. But so we know what the pros are. Obviously, I read this on Kindle, but I think the cons list is really good. He starts, I think a good book like this talking about, so you want to move to this foreign country. Here's how to know if this is the right decision for you or not. And he talks about the cons. He says, the cost of living is high, Alcoholic beverages are taxed by alcohol content, so liquor is prohibitively expensive. He says driving is frustrating because of the signage and the ramps and all that kind of stuff. He said you get used to. He said even for Americans, you get used to driving on the other lanes. It's not that. He said it's more like the behavior of the drivers and things like that. The value of the U.S. dollar is low. I mean, the value of the New Zealand dollar lags behind the U.S. dollar. So he said, minimum wage is 13 New Zealand dollars per hour, so it's pretty low. Like, again, I mentioned the economics before. Internet, I mean, we're so spoiled living in Taiwan because the internet there is much more expensive. He says, $40 a month for 5 gigabytes, and then you run out if you watch videos and stuff, obviously, and then they dial it back. He said if you want to watch videos or download media, you'll be paying $60 to $100 a month, and even then you're going to run out of bandwidth. Bacon, chicken, pickles, and popcorn are prohibitively expensive. There are no Twizzlers or Reese's Pieces. It's such a great, it gets, it's my kind of nonfiction, similar to the Alcohol Mantle Lamps books that I recommended. It's written in a straightforward, straight to the point, short book, matter of fact, and with a personal touch about things like that. Like for me in Taiwan, I really missed Monster energy drink, but now Taiwan has it. But for the first 5 years or so, 5-6 years that I've lived here, they didn't have it. So that was like the one. He goes into that. It's very personal. It's like, okay, here's what I don't like. Here's what I like. The selection of, I thought this was very interesting. He says, the selection of goods is very limited. So one thing he notices versus like a supermarket in the U.S., you go in there and there's like 30 different brands of shampoo or deodorant or whatever. He says there it's like they have everything you need, but they just don't have the variety. There might be 4 or 5 options instead of 30 in the U.S., right? So he says you notice people that you work with, you get used to seeing people wearing the same clothes as you because you all shop at the same one department store in the town. So he said you often see people on the street and at work and outside who are just wearing the exact same clothes that you are. So he said but he said a lot of Pacific Islanders who come from smaller islands, for them the variety is great, but if you're coming from the U.S. you're really spoiled on that thing. And he talks about the intense UV rays that will melt your face off because the burn time in New Zealand is really short.
Skin cancer is a problem there.
Yeah, I think white skinned people living in Australia and New Zealand have the highest skin cancer rates in the world.
That's right. Yeah.
And he also says the winter is he has a whole chapter on how awful the winter is. He says the winter is like solid 6 months of being cold all the time. And in the summer is great and the weather is beautiful, but he calls them, I think, apocalyptic hordes of mosquitoes to contend with. So it's not, he kind of if you're very dreamy about, I'm going to move to New Zealand and everything's going to be perfect, he gives you a dose of reality, which is good. But then in the end, he says, do I regret moving to New Zealand? Not for a moment.
Right.
Absolutely worth it. But he says, you've got to have the right mindset. You've got to come for the right reason.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in Taiwan, when I lived on the North Coast, I saw a lot of foreigners move to Taiwan, and they ended up where I was, and they were so miserable and unhappy because they were very social people. They wanted to go to nightclubs and party and go to bars and drink and meet friends, and that's not what you do on the North Coast of Taiwan. If you want to surf and hike, and you're a writer like me, and you're kind of don't mind being alone in a coffee shop and just writing, it was perfect for me. Right. But I would tell those people, look, don't give up on Taiwan. Just move to Taipei.
Go to Taipei.
You need to be in Taipei. There's no expat scene out here. This is for the outdoors. So I think he gives you that kind of this is the kind of person you need to be, to move to New Zealand, right?
What's their immigration status?
The technical stuff is in the book. So, hey, buy this guy's book if you want to know all about the immigration process. He goes through all the visas and stuff, but I'm afraid if I tried to answer that, I would get it wrong.
But I mean, they have permanent residency.
Yeah,
now?
they have residency.
Okay.
Yeah, they have residency. I think what they recommend, because they're quite young, is like you get a working holiday visa.
Yes.
Move there, but go ahead and start working on your residency visa. That's something he said. He said, I wish I'd done that before. He said, I would have started working on my, or maybe it's something he did and he was glad he did it, was start working on your residency visa before moving there. But the idea is, because jobs are only pretty much filled in New Zealand, a lot of jobs are filled by going in physically, you know, and interviewing. Move there on a working holiday visa, and then you're on a time limit to line up a permanent job, and then you're ready to go for your residency visa. You know, you're going to get there and be looking for a job. One thing that so he goes into all a little bit of the technical details, and he's got links in the book like this is what you need to do. But he says, you know, as far as all the legal stuff goes, you got to look at it like it's just a bunch of paperwork. What does it take to move to New Zealand? A lot of paperwork. Mm-hmm. You know, that's what it is. You know, and he gives a step-by-step process.
You don't need to have a certain amount of money in your bank account?
You do, yeah. I forgot what it was, but he said, you know, you have to prove that you have a certain amount of money in your bank account. And that's one of those things that changes. And there's the skill list too, right? Like if you are skilled in a trade, like I know like sheet metal worker and stuff like that, there's a lot of like trade skills that they're desperately in need of, and the listings change. So he says, you know, go here and check out the listings and da-da-da-da-da.
Right.
I'm not sure exactly what, you know, what his job is. I mean, but having been in the military, he might have a trade, you know, some kind of skill.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the wife is an educator, so she has a skill that is probably in demand. Yeah. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is. When I was in Auckland, I just walked into an English school. I just walked in off the street. I said, I know this is crazy. I'm a tourist. I'm here with my backpack, but I'm also a teacher. I'm just wondering, like, could I find work here? Yeah. And they're like, oh yeah, definitely. I mean,
that's good to know.
You know, it's like if you want to work here, just shoot us an email. There are many other schools, and I saw just walking around, there were a lot of like, you know, English private schools. Yeah. ESL. So
that's interesting.
Yeah, it was definitely a possibility. In fact, it was when I was in New Zealand that I got the idea to immigrate. Like I was in New Zealand, and I realized, okay, I could find work here. But then I thought, why don't I just go to Asia? And so when I went back home, I applied for a teaching position in Korea, and I was gone within 6 months.
Oh, interesting.
And you know, here it is 12 years later.
And you're in Taiwan.
Yep.
That's the thing about Taiwan. I got to warn people, you know, a lot of places are good places to visit, and some places are good places to live. Taiwan traps a lot of people. A lot of people come to Taiwan and never leave.
Oh, we trapped?
Well, yeah, in a good way. You know, I mean, a lot of people come here and think, yeah, I'll do a few years here, and then I'll travel here, and I'll travel here, and they come to Taiwan, and they're like, yep, I like it. Stick around. And I think New Zealand, Oh, but so the winter thing was something that kind of made me think twice about how well I would do in New Zealand. He talks about how this kind of surprised me, and it would surprise Americans, I think, a lot. He said, you know, maybe less so than Europeans. He talked about how pretty much all the houses and the kind of house that you're going to be able to afford when you're moving there on a budget, you know, without a high-paying job, are uninsulated. And I don't often do this, but I want to read a passage to give you a feel of the book, because I think you'll appreciate his writing style. He says, let's see. He talks about the winter. He says, this might not sound like a big deal well, I should just give the background, is that, you know, basically you're looking at getting an electric blanket and being cold and wearing a lot of layers inside. But he says, that might not sound like a big deal until you wake up at 6:30 in the morning and it's dead cold in your room and your electric blanket turned itself off hours ago. So you don't want to move because you don't want to lose any of the heat you have trapped under your blanket. But you have to go to work. So after working up the courage, you dash from your bed to the shower, skipping on your tiptoes because the wood floor is freezing. Then you wedge yourself into a cold ceramic shower and turn on the water and wait for it to heat up while you squirm like an alien. Then you don't want to get out of the shower because it's cold out there and you're all wet and you know you're going to just snap freeze as soon as you get out of the shower. And you know you're not going to dry yourself completely because you'll be in too much of a hurry to get your warm clothes on. Plus, since the humidity never drops below London fog, your towels are permanently damp and asthma-inducing, sinus-infecting mold grows on all the windowsills. So if you end up going to work, you end up going to work feeling like a swamp beast. And on your way to work, you stop to get gas and pay $9 a gallon to fill up your micro car.
So that doesn't sound so appealing.
No, it doesn't. So it's he gives you a dose of that, and he says the property. He has a long section on how awful the property managers in New Zealand are. He said the house that they eventually got, which they like, they had to sign the lease before seeing the inside. And he said. He said New Zealand property managers are masters of faking photographs or doing misleading photographs. And he said, you're probably going to live with roommates. He says it's quite common in New Zealand, especially in Auckland, for grown adults or even elderly people to live with housemates or other adults and elderly people. So he said, you may be in a house with another family or another couple or 3 couples living in a house. And he said it's just very common there because housing is so expensive. Food is expensive. Chicken, he said, it's like, maybe 4 pieces of boneless chicken, $14. Stuff like that. So it's, you got to look at it and weigh out what you can live with and what you can live without. Right. And Haan, he gets into his own personal politics a bit. One of the things that so that may put people off the book, but I think it's fair enough, just be honest. I mean, I'm not, he's saying, well, your tax money's not going to pay for stupid wars and stuff like that, and, some people are going to agree with that. Some people are going to disagree with that, but, he feels, he feels like he likes the politics of New Zealand a lot. So he's not afraid to share it, to just be honest and share his personal political feelings about what he can live with and what he can't live with. He seems to like the culture of New Zealand a lot better than the culture of Texas, for sure. And he gives a lot of examples about that. I've been to Texas once, but I quite like the culture of Tennessee. I never hate on Tennessee. I mean, I'm from Tennessee, and I love Tennessee.
Where did you go in Texas?
I just stopped.
You told me this.
Yeah, I was teaching English for an organization that was based in Texas, and I can't remember if it was Houston or where I flew into, but I had kind of like a debriefing at their headquarters. So I flew back in. I was jet lagged.
What was the organization?
I had a meeting. Well, I don't want to go into my whole job stuff, but I just visited Texas for a day. That's the message. I just thought it was very flat and very hot, but I was super jet lagged because I'd been teaching in Malaysia or Hong Kong or somewhere, and because I did 2 summers for them. But anyway, it's a really great book. I think as a supplement to a travel guide, right? Like if you're going to buy like a Lonely Planet, or I have like a DK guide to New Zealand on the shelf and a Lonely Planet to the shelf. If you're planning a vacation in New Zealand, I would highly suggest reading this book because it's short, it's well written, and it gives you, it's like talking to an expat that's lived there for a long time. So you might get something out of this that you won't get from a travel guide that just says, oh, it's all wonderful, and this is wonderful, and this restaurant's wonderful, and this hotel is wonderful, and everything's perfect, and you can look at all the fun things you can do. He gives you more of an insight of working here. One funny thing he says, is New Zealand a great place to raise kids? Yes. Make sure you take them to some awful country somewhere so they can get some perspective growing up. Like they'll be spoiled if you raise kids in New Zealand. So take them on vacation somewhere awful so they can appreciate it. And he has a funny chapter about how Kiwis talk. You know, like the convenience store is called the dairy. You know, pie means meat pie. Fanny apparently means vagina, not ass to Kiwis. So he said, you know, if my wife says, you know, does this dress make my fanny look big? He says, no, it doesn't make your vagina look big. It's just, you know, funny things that, you know, again, geared more towards Americans. So, I mean, people from the Commonwealth might say, oh, you know, they already know all this stuff. It's not such a leap for them, right? So that's the caveat. I don't know if I would recommend this book for someone who's already familiar with New Zealand culture, but for an uninitiated person, or for Americans who haven't traveled much, for sure. Like, it's a fantastic book, and more anecdotes than I could possibly talk about. But great job. I think since this guy is also self-published, I think maybe I'll reach out to him and his wife after this episode and say, hey, what do you think about the review? And share it around. But I haven't had any contact with this author. But seems down to earth. Oh, one last thing I'll mention, and then I'll turn it over to you. Something that I thought was interesting was talks about the work culture. So it's the pro and the con is the same. The standards of professionalism are pretty low. People drink beer at work. People work with no shoes on. So it's very common to see people in an office with no shoes. But he said because it's so laid back, standards of like efficiency and reliability are kind of low and frustrating for someone coming from the U.S. Oh, and one final point. I think this was a very interesting thing to note. Healthcare. Of course, he talks about healthcare. You've got to talk about healthcare when you're moving from the U.S. to anywhere, right? You're going to mention healthcare. But I thought his perspective on this was very good. He said, look, yeah, healthcare is much more affordable in New Zealand for sure. But like he was born with like some problems. Like I think he was a twin, and so like he was the first twin, so he was born like premature and like had maybe a heart issue or something like that. And he said, look, if I hadn't been born 30 years ago, if I hadn't been born in the U.S., I might not have made it. I might not have survived. But that comes at a price. America, he's basically saying, look, if you've got some weird, rare condition and you need specialists or you need the best of the best medical care in the world, you got to be in the U.S. But socialized medicine is great because it means you can go to the doctor whenever you want and not have to pay an arm and a leg. And he said he hasn't had to go to the doctor that much, but he gives a few things that he had done and compared the cost, and it was so much lower in New Zealand.
Of course.
Yeah, it's so much lower. But like he said, in the U.S., if you got the money, you can have the best medical care in the world. But if you just want to see a doctor, yeah. But and if you're at the point where you just don't, I think so many people, who don't have high paying jobs, they just don't want to see a doctor for anything,
in the States,
in the States,
of
right?
Course.
So in New Zealand, you don't have that. You don't have that worry. So he has, good perspective. As much as he seems to really dislike American culture or aspects of it, and very much like New Zealand culture, he's fair. And that's what I like about him. He seems, I agree with a lot of his opinions. I don't agree with some of them, but I think it's fair enough. Fair enough. And we know where you're coming from, so we can, make our assessments about these different things. So,
yeah.
Good job, yeah. Highly recommend this book. What do you got for us in the fiction department today?
The work of another canonical author.
Another canonical author.
Do you see a pattern here?
I do see a pattern. You're giving us all your canonical authors.
Okay, well, the canonical author that I'm focusing on for this episode is William S. Burroughs.
Okay.
Do you know him?
I know of him, yeah. I've heard the name
Not
many
to
times.
be confused with Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Right, exactly.
Okay. So William
but I haven't read anything by this man.
Okay. Well, maybe you will be inspired to do that after.
Maybe I will.
After you hear what I have to say. I'm talking about his book, The Western Lands. So a bit about William S. Burroughs, the canonical author. He's the grandson, or was the grandson, of William S. Burroughs I, inventor of the adding machine.
That's why I know.
And later, Burroughs computers.
Yeah, there you go.
He's also the nephew of the public relations guru Ivy Lee. Mm-hmm. So he came from a very affluent, well-connected St. Louis family, but he was a bit of an outsider. Not only was he gay, but he was also a drug addict. So his first publications, in fact, were thinly veiled autobiographical works called Junkie and Queer. And so, you know, many years ago, like maybe when I was a teenager or at university, I had been exposed to some of his works, and you know,
I thought you were going to say drugs there for a minute.
Well, maybe. But you know, I read some excerpts. It was like descriptions of shooting heroin and erotic encounters with Moroccan and Latin rent boys
at the same time.
Sometimes, yeah.
All right.
And so I wasn't that interested.
Yeah.
I should also point out that before he seriously focused on his writing, he accidentally killed and or murdered his wife while they were living in Mexico. So
wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big difference between between accidentally killed and murdered.
Well, he was, you know, he was already a junkie at that time, and his wife, he had a sort of marriage of convenience, I guess, but his wife was allegedly mocking him for, you know, cavorting with young boys, and he said, "Well, darling, it's time for our William Tell act." And so I think he put a bottle on her head, and he you know, tried to shoot the bottle off, and he missed. Well, he may have
Jeez.
hit part of the bottle, but he also hit her in the head, and so, you know, it turned out that she died. There were legal complications in Mexico, but through his family connections, he was able to, you know, to escape. I think he was in prison for a while, but it was eventually ruled a mishap or an accident, you know, and so there was some reduced manslaughter charge, and he eventually escaped. But this is the background to the works that he wrote later in life. Some very, I mean, we talked about transgressive literature before, right? Yeah. A lot of his work would fit that description. So anyway, when I was first exposed to his work many years ago, I wasn't that interested, even though I knew that he had influenced not only many musicians that I admire. David Bowie, for instance, was a student of Burroughs, Iggy Pop, and many other rock musicians. And in fact, Burroughs has had a major influence on popular culture. The phrase heavy metal, that comes from his books.
Interesting.
I didn't know that. The phrase Blade Runner.
Oh, really?
That was taken from, I believe, a screenplay that he wrote. I think he borrowed the phrase from someone else, but Ridley Scott, it was Ridley Scott, right, that did Blade Runner. You know, that's based on a Philip K. Dick novel. Yeah. It's not called Blade Runner, right? Or it's a story. It's what, do androids dream of electric sheep, right? Why is the movie called Blade Runner?
Yeah.
They took that from a William S. Burroughs screenplay, and I think they paid him a royalty for that, even though he had taken it from someone else or something.
I just want to say before you go on, I would probably have been put off by that knowledge too. Like if I knew that he might have intentionally offed his wife in Mexico or something. But I think it's so important. Like I know it's a tendency, like if you get some dirt on the author, to say like, I don't want to read, that author. But I think, the story stands on its own, right? Like I hope if people watch this and they're like, well, that Bradley Verdell guy is so annoying, and it's just, I don't like the look of him, and I don't like his voice, or I don't like whatever. I hope they would still give my work a try. And that's one of the things about being an author, right? Is that you hope people remember what you wrote, not who wrote it, right? It's like, I don't want, the man behind the work at some point is kind of irrelevant. Like the story, if the story is a great story, then it's a great story, and it doesn't matter who wrote it.
Yeah. Well, that's an important point to make.
So everybody put aside your prejudices about this author and give the Western lands a try, judge the idea, not the thinker, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, nobody's really certain what happened, but it's Burroughs himself said that after that event in Mexico, he was invaded by what he called the ugly spirit. So, he definitely deals with dark, heavy, transgressive themes in his work.
Yeah.
But to continue with some of the information on his pop culture influence, the band Soft Machine, or the Soft Machine, a fusion group from the 60s and 70s, they took their name from a novel of his. Steely Dan, you've heard of them, right?
Steely Dan.
So Steely Dan is the name of a dildo in his novel Naked Lunch. The number 23, that's like a bad luck number, which
no, I've never heard
often. Oh yeah, the number 23 is that's something of a meme, I guess, and it figures prominently in his works.
I've been in Asia too long. Here 4 is the unlucky number. It sounds like death in Chinese.
Yeah, well, 23 is thought to be a harbinger of death. Like, some famous ship captain said, I've never had a ship sink. I've never experienced any mishaps when out on the ocean. Oh, how many times have you been out? 22. And then the next day was number 23, and he sunk and drowned. So that's the significance of 23. Its negative connotations are probably, in the popular imagination, are probably somewhat due to his influence. But anyway, he's associated with the Beats. You've heard of the Beats, like Ginsberg, Kerouac.
Yeah.
I never was that interested in those writers. On the Road, that's fine. That's an enjoyable novel. Ginsberg's Howl, that's an interesting poem. But I wasn't interested in reading more.
Didn't grab you.
Yeah, I didn't consider them canonical. And since Burroughs was associated with them, and then the early samples of his work that I read didn't really do anything for me, he wasn't on my radar. But then, probably about 5 years ago, I decided to read Naked Lunch, which is his first. I'd read excerpts from this, but I'd never read it in its entirety, and I thought I should check that off the list. I'm going to read that. So I did, and it was in some ways a shambles. Like, it's just the book is just like a car wreck, but it's a fascinating car wreck, and I thought this is interesting enough that I'm going to continue reading. So next I like to proceed chronologically. So next I read his Nova trilogy, also known as the Cut Up trilogy, which consists of The Soft Machine, The Ticket That Exploded, and Nova Express. And these have greatly influenced a lot of rock musicians. And then he uses what he calls the cut up method, which is basically literary collage. So he takes different texts, cuts them up, throws them together in what he calls the cement mixer. It's an old surrealist trick, but it that method leads to some interesting literary results. And no one had really written novels. They'd written like short poems that were cut ups. A lot of rock music lyrics are cut ups. David Bowie used that method. Like he would type up a page with phrases that he wanted to include, and then he'd cut it up, throw them in a hat, and just start randomly drawing out, and then piece them together, and of course do some editing. But it's a way to introduce chance into your compositions. But no one had really done this with novels, so he's definitely an innovator as well. So then I continued with his next trilogy, which is the Red Knight trilogy, and this is his masterpiece: Cities of the Red Knight, The Place of Dead Roads, and finally, The Western Lands. Okay. So this is the last major book that he wrote before his death. He did publish another book of dreams. It's called My Education, a book of dreams. It's kind of a dream journal. There's some interesting sections of that work too. But his last major book is The Western Lands. So why do I choose this as my favorite Burroughs book?
Yeah.
Probably for the Egyptian mythology. The Western Lands, first of all, are an Egyptian paradise which one arrives at through the land of the dead. Okay. So, in a way, it's a guidebook. It's kind of a book of the dead, right? It's like, how do you make your way to the Western Lands? He asks, do the Western Lands still exist? They cannot have disappeared without leaving a blueprint behind. We set out to find that blueprint. So it's a search for this ancient Egyptian concept of the Western Lands.
That does sound interesting.
And so along the way, he one of my favorite sections is the part near the beginning where he discusses the 7 Egyptian souls.
Okay.
So we think of, how do you think of the soul? What is the soul?
I don't think there is such a thing as the soul.
Right.
I mean,
fair enough.
I always wonder that. Like, everyone takes for granted that there is such a thing.
Right.
I tend to doubt that, but
different cultures,
have
especially ancient cultures,
have
different concepts of what the soul is. And according to Burroughs, the Egyptians recognized 7 Egyptian souls.
Yeah.
So there's one called Ren, which is the secret name. There is 2, Sekhem, which is energy, power, and light. 3, Ku, the guardian angel.
I've heard
4,
of some of these, yeah.
Ba, the heart. 5, Ka, the double. The Ka is pretty well known, I think.
Yeah.
6, Kaibit, the shadow, memory. And 7, Sekhu, the remains. So he introduces this concept of the 7 souls early in the book, and then he refers to different aspects or different souls, I guess, throughout the text. And as is characteristic of all of his works, perhaps because of this cut-up method, there's always a great deal of intertextuality. That's a new term.
Okay.
Hashtag intertextuality.
Define it.
Do you have any idea of what that is?
Well, I mean, it sounds to me like, how do you say that? Like getting maybe influences by a lot of other literature, right?
Yes.
So, and you kind of maybe assume that your readers have read these other works.
That's right.
So that's one of the hard things about reading Don Quixote, especially with my students in Taiwan, is like Cervantes, he references all these other works that his
Yeah.
contemporary readers would
That
have
they're not
read,
familiar
and it's
with.
just you have to So all the So I would say that's intertextuality.
Yes. Well, and so something similar. You can expect something similar in the works of Burroughs, but a lot of the intertextuality includes references to his own works. Not only does he reintroduce themes from previous books, but characters from other books of his appear, in later works, and so really the Western Lands is the culmination of all his efforts.
Interesting.
If you, and it's a standalone text, even though it's the third installment in this trilogy. You could just read the Western Lands alone, and it would be fine. Although you'd be missing a lot because of these references to concepts and characters and things that appear in other books of his, and it's always different. Like, it's never you always get a unique perspective on whatever, even if it's something he's discussed before. He treats it in a completely new way. But one of the recurring characters is the old man of the mountain, otherwise known as Hassan y Sabah. Now, he was mentioned by Marco Polo, and was he a real historical personage, or was he mythical? We don't know.
Yeah.
But he is the old man of the mountain who trained assassins. Okay, and so he was feared by all of the political entities that were in his area, but he was also employed by various warlords and warring factions, right? So the story is that do you know the etymology of assassin?
No.
It's related to our word hashish.
Huh.
So the idea was that these assassins would smoke hashish, go into a kind of trance, and then go do their deed. It's kind of like the Nordic warriors that would go berserk. Right?
Yeah,
they would work themselves
gin
into
yourself
kind
up.
of and then go do some awful deed.
Yeah.
So anyway, in Burroughs' treatment of this myth or legend, he's actually like a kind of Sufi wise man, So he appears again in the Western Lands. He probably appears more prominently in Cities of the Red Knight, but again, he appears in a different guise, with a different narrative purpose in the Western Lands.
So if you're more well-read, it's a richer experience. Like, you can read it and enjoy it, but it's a bit richer if you've read other stuff by Burroughs and maybe other contemporary authors.
Yes, definitely. Okay. But I would say that the Western Lands it's his last major book, and it contains all the wisdom of his previous books. So if you want to, if you've never read any Burroughs, this might be a good place to start. If you're a completionist like me, then start with Naked Lunch and just
go straight through.
Yeah, or actually, I guess Junkie and Queer, which I've not read yet, but you could start with Naked Lunch and then work your way up to the Western Lands. But I would say it's his masterpiece. Just a few quotes that I like. He says, "Writers don't write; they read and transcribe something already written." Mm-hmm. There's a lot of wisdom about the craft of writing. In fact, there's a character, Neferti the scribe, who's an ancient Egyptian, writer essentially, and so through that character, Burroughs is able to, discuss his own craft of writing. And then towards the end, he says, the old writer, perhaps he's referring to himself, couldn't write anymore because he had reached the end of words, the end of what can be done with words. And this was written when he was 72, 73, so he knows it's like the end of his life, and
he's done everything he can.
And so he's obsessed with the land of the dead and finding the Western lands, and it's a 5-star masterpiece.
Excellent. That's so interesting. Think we'll ever get to that point? Are we going to get to the end of words?
I don't know. I'm not there yet.
I'm a thrill seeker. Just before we sign off here, I'll just say, I've tried so many different things in my life: skydiving, rock climbing, surfing. I love outdoor sports. I love thrills. I love trying to get that rush and that excitement of it. Finishing a novel, that nothing compares to that feeling. And I have to, something I'm looking forward to in my life is that I'm writing my Chadwick Yates series. And when I finish the series, I'm trying to get ready to release book 8 right now. And maybe it goes to 12 books, maybe it goes to more. But when I finish the series, if that is an even bigger high than finishing one novel, I can't wait.
Oh, I would think so.
Because how many times in your life can you get the rush of hitting the publish button on the last book in a long series like that? I mean, a lot of self-published authors will do a trilogy and a trilogy and a trilogy. And I'm sure finishing a trilogy is a lot more exciting than finishing one book. But, if I'm looking at finishing a series I've been working on for, 6 years plus, then it's like, wow, that's going to be a milestone in my life. And I can, I can imagine being, if we keep writing until, we're elderly, looking back, it's going to be fun to look at the shelf. I'll have a little shelf wherever I live where those are the books I wrote in my life, and that's going to be a great feeling. No matter how much you write. So, if you're watching this because you're also a writer, I hope that's inspiring. If you're somebody, I assume people who are watching this love reading and love literature, fiction or nonfiction, and probably you, like us, prefer reading more than TV or whatever. If you have that idea in your mind and you think, I want to write a novel, write that novel. It's important, but it's not urgent, right? That's the thing. There's never a notification on your phone is never going to pop on and say, oh, you better work on that novel. Your family, your friends, your job, nobody's going to ever make you write a novel. It's never urgent. It's never an emergency, like I have to do it. But it's important. It'll be one of the most meaningful things you do in your life. But if you don't do it, it'll never happen. Nobody else is going to make you do it, right?
That's true.
It's fair to say. Anyway, we'll be back with more Authors Recommend Books in a week. All right. See you next time. We'll put the links to the Western Lands and tips for immigrating to New Zealand in the description. And if you want to follow Mark on social media or follow me on social media, those links are in the descriptions. Buy our books as well, and hopefully...
And music.
And music, that's right. Listen to Mark's music. Read our books. Oh, and then last thing, I haven't mentioned this in past episodes, but I need to start mentioning this every time. If you have read my books, any of my books or any of Mark's books, please consider writing a review on Amazon, an honest review. It is so tremendously important for authors. If you read our books and you like them, please give us a review, even if it's just a star rating. Every review helps, and it's always great to see a new review pop up and see what people think. So, see you next time.